HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Vicious Circle, Mysteries and Crime Stories from the Algonquin Round Table, by Otto Penzler, read by James Romick. Introduction. Has there ever been a more exciting decade in the past century than the 1920s, especially in New York? Jack Dempsey lived and fought here. Babe Ruth hit home runs for the Yankees. Flappers and their beaux filled speakeasies. Helen Hayes was on Broadway. The Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Astors dominated the social scene. And the most famous literary coterie in the history of America, the Algonquin Round Table, created itself. It had not been planned. Writers and editors for The New Yorker drifted into the Oak Room of the nearby hotel late in 1919. Since they were well known and influential, actors and publicists soon followed, hoping for mention in that young but already important magazine. Producers turned up next. The table hopping became so ubiquitous that the hotel manager prepared a very large table in the adjoining Rose Room so that the ever-expanding group could simply be proximate, rather than having to stand around various tables, blocking the aisles to the inevitable irritation of the waiters and the excluded diners. The big round table was soon full not only at lunch, but at cocktail hour, which lasted for most of the day for many members, dinner, and late-night supper as well. It was an amorphous group, informal, and with an ever-changing membership so volatile that it was difficult to determine who was, in fact, a member. Dorothy Parker, probably the one person most famously identified as the central figure at the Round Table, in later years denied that she was ever part of it, in spite of the photographs and newspaper and magazine stories and columns of the day in which she was relentlessly quoted. Ring Lardner did not attend the lunches, but socialized with numerous members, played poker with them, and wrote skits for a lavish Broadway production, The 49ers, that failed because it had so many inside jokes that it was understood by no one besides roundtablers. Alexander Woollcott, the heart of the group, was among the first to be a regular and among the last to drift away. Harpo Marx was often at the table, as were the columnists Frank P. Adams and Haywood Broun and his wife Ruth Hale. The playwrights Marc Connelly, George S. Kaufman, Edna Ferber, and Robert Sherwood were regulars for a while, often meeting to collaborate on new works. The critic and humorous writer and actor Robert Benchley was a mainstay of the group, as was Harold Ross, the founder of The New Yorker. Among the many celebrities who often stopped by were Tallulah Bankhead and Noel Coward. The primary activity of these notables, apart from the consumption of vast quantities of alcohol, seems to have been the display of wit, most of it caustic, often aimed at other members of the group and just as often at themselves. Woollcott, described by a critic as the worst writer in America, retorted, "I'm potentially the best writer in America, but I never had anything to say." Benchley, who regarded himself a failure, said, "It took me 15 years to discover that I had no talent for writing, but I couldn't give it up because by that time I was too famous." No one in what became known as the Vicious Circle was immune from becoming a target for someone else's nasty humor. After Woollcott autographed a copy of his book, Shouts and Murmurs, he asked with satisfaction, "What is so rare as a Woollcott first edition?" Adams replied, "A Woollcott second edition." Woollcott once described his luncheon companion of many years, Harold Ross, as looking like a dishonest Abe Lincoln. In her youth, Dorothy Parker's vitriolic wit was masked by her look of demure innocence, giving rise to Woollcott's description, "Dorothy Parker is a combination of Little Nell and Lady Macbeth." When Adams wrote a scathing review of a book by Broun, his fellow roundtabler Woollcott said, "You can see Frank's scratches on Haywood's back yet." Edna Ferber, planning a European vacation, said she wanted to be alone on the trip. "I don't expect to talk to a man or a woman, just Alec Woollcott." On a different occasion, Ferber showed up for a lunch at the Round Table wearing one of her tailored suits. Noel Coward greeted her by saying, "You look almost like a man." Ferber replied, "So do you." Upon the publication of a newly discovered Charles Dickens manuscript, Kaufman, known for his intense work habits, said of Connelly, his former collaborator, just as famous for his casual attitude to work, "Charles Dickens, dead, writes more than Marc Connelly alive." In the early days of the Round Table, before the petty jealousies and personality frictions eroded friendships, the members were young, talented, and mostly struggling to earn money. They hoped to use each other and also to help each other achieve success, both critical and financial. They accomplished this to a degree, though it has often been noted that virtually none of them ever achieved the heights to which they seemed destined, their names largely lost to history. Ring Lardner, the greatest of them, was already successful when he befriended members of the group. During the years in which he was closely associated with them, 1922 to 1925, he wrote not a single story. It would take a student of American literature to recall a single work by Dorothy Parker, remembered today almost entirely for her outrageous witticisms at the table. George S. Kaufman went on to produce some of Broadway's greatest successes only after he pulled away from the group. Robert Benchley, regarded as a young genius, had to move out of the Algonquin in order to get any work done, by which time he already regretted that he had made himself into a public clown. Woollcott, once an enormously influential critic, is mainly recalled today, if at all, as the inspiration for the cantankerous and arrogant Sheridan Whiteside in The Man Who Came to Dinner. As the most sophisticated New Yorkers of their era, noted for hilarious if brutal wit, they seemed an unlikely source for mystery, crime, and suspense fiction. Yet they produced a good deal of it. Most of it is humorous, as one might expect, and witty. Along with Lardner's often anthologized Haircut, which is one of the greatest stories of the 20th century, the most famous crime story produced by a member of the Round Table, too long to include in this book, is The Petrified Forest, the Robert Sherwood play that starred Leslie Howard as Alan Squire, a failed world-weary British intellectual, and made a star of the young Humphrey Bogart for his role as Duke Mantee, a desperate criminal. Both Howard and Bogart starred in the Warner Brothers film. Connelly's Coroner's Verdict won the O. Henry Prize in 1930. The stories in this collection range from the silly and lightweight to the poignant and profound. There is little classic detection, not many realistic detectives, and less nail-biting suspense than in a more usual anthology. But the stories have charm, innocence, and a casual joyfulness that evoke another era, a time when music and laughter were part of the commonplace of daily life. Otto Penzler, New York, March 2007. Marc Connelly. Born December 13, 1885, in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, Marc Connelly was bitten by the drama bug early, composing his own plays at the age of 5. He went on to become a journalist for the Pittsburgh Sun before moving to New York. He was one of the earliest members of the Algonquin Round Table and collaborated on several comedies with another enthusiastic member, George S. Kaufman. Dulcie, 1921, 22 Little Old Millersville, 1921-22, Merton of the Movies, 1922, and Beggar on Horseback, 1925. Merton of the Movies, based on a 1922 novel by Harry Leon Wilson, was extremely successful, running for 392 performances on Broadway before going on the road. His most important work was Green Pastures, 1931, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize for drama. A retelling of the Old Testament, it was the first Broadway play to feature an all-black cast. His autobiography, Voices Off Stage, was published in 1968. He died December 21, 1980. Coroner's Inquest was originally published in the February 8, 1930 issue of Collier's. It won the O. Henry Prize that year. I always knew children were antisocial, but the children of the West Side, they're savage. Marc Connelly. Coroner's Inquest by Marc Connelly. What is your name? Frank Weingod. Where do you live? 185 West 55th Street. What is your business? I'm a stage manager for Hello America. You were the employer for James Dahl? In a way. We both worked for Mr. Bender, the producer, but I have charge backstage. Do you know Theodore Roble? Yes, sir. Was he in your company, too? No, sir. I met him when we started rehearsals. That was about 3 months ago, in June. We sent out a call for midgets, and he and Jimmy showed up together, with a lot of others. Roble was too big for us. I didn't see him again until we broke into their room Tuesday. You discovered their bodies? Yes, sir. Mrs. Pike there was with me. You found them both dead? Yes, sir. How did you happen to be over in Jersey City? Well, I called up his house at curtain time Monday night when I found Jimmy hadn't shown up for the performance. Mrs. Pike told me they were both out, and I asked her to have either Jimmy or Robo call me when they came in. Then Mrs. Pike called me Tuesday morning and said she'd tried to get into the room, but she'd found the door was bolted. She said all the other roomers were out and she was alone and scared. I kinda suspected something might be wrong. So I said to wait and I'd come over. Then I took the tube over and got there about noon. Then we went up and I broke down the door. Did you see this knife there? Yes, sir. It was on the floor, about a foot from Jimmy. You say you suspected something was wrong. What do you mean by that? I mean, I felt something might have happened to Jimmy. Nothing like this, of course. But I knew he'd been feeling very depressed lately, and I know Roble wasn't helping to cheer him up any. You mean that they had had quarrels? No, sir. They just both had the blues. Roble had had them for a long time. Roble was Jimmy's brother-in-law. He'd married Jimmy's sister. She was a midget, too, about 5 years ago, but she died a year or so later. Jimmy had been living with them, and after the sister died, he and Roble took a room in Mrs. Pike's house together. How did you learn this? Jimmy and I were pretty friendly at the theater. He was a nice little fellow and seemed grateful that I'd given him his job. We'd only needed one midget for the Oriental scene in the second act, and the agencies had sent about 15. Mr. Gehring, the director, told me to pick one of them as he was busy, and I picked Jimmy because he was the littlest. After I got to know him, he told me how glad he was I'd given him the job. He hadn't worked for nearly a year. He wasn't little enough to be a featured midget in the circuses or in museums, so he had to take whatever came along. Anyway, we got to be friendly, and he used to tell me about his brother-in-law and all. He never suggested there might be ill feeling between him and his brother-in-law. No, sir. I don't imagine he'd ever had any words at all with Roble. As a matter of fact, from what I could gather, I guess Jimmy had quite a lot of affection for him, and he certainly did everything he could to help him. Roble was a lot worse off than Jimmy. Roble hadn't worked for a couple of years, and Jimmy practically supported him. He used to tell me how Roble had been sunk ever since he got his late growth. His what? His late growth. I heard it happens among midgets often, but Jimmy told me about it first. Usually a midget will stay as long as he lives at whatever height he reaches when he's 14 or 15, but every now and then one of them starts growing again just before he's 30, and he can grow a foot or even more in a couple of years. Then he stops growing for good, but of course he don't look so much like a midget anymore. That's what happened to Roble about 3 years ago. Of course, he had trouble getting jobs and it hit him pretty hard. From what Jimmy told me and from what Mrs. Pike says, I guess he used to talk about it all the time. Roble used to come over and see his agent in New York twice a week, but there was never anything for him. Then he'd go back to Jersey City. Most of the week he lived alone because after the show started, Jimmy often stayed in New York with a cousin or somebody that lived uptown.
Lately, Roble hadn't been coming over to New York at all. But every Saturday night, Jimmy would go over to Jersey City and stay until Monday with him, trying to cheer him up. Every Sunday, they'd take a walk and go to a movie. I guess as they walked along the street, Roble realized most the difference in their heights. And I guess that's why they're both dead now.
How do you mean?
Well, as I told you, Jimmy would try to sympathize with Roble and cheer him up. He and Roble both realized that Jimmy was working and supporting them, and that Jimmy would probably keep right on working, according to the ordinary breaks of the game, while Roble would always be too big. It simply preyed on Roble's mind. And then 3 weeks ago Monday, Jimmy thought he saw the axe fall. I was standing outside the stage door. It was about 7:30, and Jimmy came down the alley. He looked down in the mouth, which I thought was strange, seeing that he usually used to come in swinging his little cane and looking pretty cheerful. I said, "How are you feeling, Jimmy?" And he said, "I don't feel so good, Mr. Weingard." So I said, "Why? What's the matter, Jimmy?" I could see there really was something the matter with him by this time. "I'm getting scared," he said, and I says, "Why?"
"I'm starting to grow again," he says.
He said it the way you'd say you just found out you had some disease that was going to kill you in a week. He looked like he was shivering. "Why, you're crazy, Jimmy," I says. "You ain't growing."
"Yes, I am," he says. "I'm 31, and it's the late growth like my brother-in-law has. My father had it, but his people had money, so it didn't make much difference to him. It's different with me. I've got to keep working." He went on like that for a while, and then I tried to kid him out of it. "You look all right to me," I said. "How tall have you been all along?" 37 inches, he says.
So I says, "Come on into the prop room and I'll measure you." He backed away from me. "No," he says, "I don't want to know how much it is." Then he went up to the dressing room before I could argue with him. All week he looked awful sunk. When he showed up the next Monday evening, he looked almost white. I grabbed him as he was starting upstairs to make up. "Come on out of it," I says. I thought he'd make a break and try to get away from me, but he didn't. He just sort of smiled as if I didn't understand. Finally he says,
"It ain't any use, Mr. Weingard."
"Listen," I says, "you've been over with that brother-in-law of yours, haven't you?" He says yes, he had. "Well," I says, "that's what's bothering you. From what you tell me about him, he's talked about his own tough luck so much that he's given you the willies too. Stay away from him the end of this week." He stood there for a second without saying anything. Then he says, "That wouldn't do any good. He's all alone over there and he needs company. Anyway, it's all up with me, I guess. I've grown nearly 2 inches already." I looked at him. He was pretty pathetic, but outside of that, there wasn't any change in him as far as I could see. I says, "Have you been measured?" He said he hadn't. Then I said, "How do you know? Your clothes fit all right, except your pants, and as a matter of fact, they seem a little longer."
"I fixed my suspenders and let them down a lot farther," he says. "Besides, they were always a little big for me."
"Let's make sure," I says. "I'll get a yardstick and we'll make absolutely sure." But I guess he was too scared to face things. He wouldn't do it. He managed to dodge me all week. Then last Saturday night I ran into him as I was leaving the theater. I asked him if he felt any better. "I feel all right," he says. He really looked scared to death. That's the last time I saw him before I went over to Jersey City after Mrs. Pike phoned me Tuesday.
Patrolman Gortlitz has testified that the bodies were in opposite ends of the room when he arrived. They were in that position when you forced open the door?
Yes, sir.
The medical examiner has testified that they were both dead of knife wounds, apparently from the same knife. Would you assume that the knife had fallen from Dahl's hands as he fell?
Yes, sir.
Has it been your purpose to suggest that both men were driven to despondency by a fear of lack of employment for Doll, and that they might have committed suicide?
No, sir. I don't think anything of the kind.
What do you mean?
Well, when Mrs. Pike and I went in the room and got a look at the knife, I said to Mrs. Pike that was a funny kind of knife for them to have in the room. You can see it's a kind of butcher knife. Then Mrs. Pike told me it was one that she'd missed from her kitchen a few weeks before. She'd never thought either Roble or Jimmy had taken it. It struck me as funny Roble or Jimmy had stolen it too. Then I put two and two together and found out what really happened. Have you got the little broken cane that was lying on the bed?
Is this it?
Yes, sir. Well, I'd never been convinced by Jimmy that he was really growing. So when Mrs. Pike told me about the knife, I started figuring. I figured that about 5 minutes before that knife came into play, Jimmy must have found it, probably by accident.
Why by accident?
Because Roble had gone a little crazy, I guess. He'd stolen it and kept it hidden from Jimmy. And when Jimmy found it, he wondered what Roble been doing with it. Then Roble wouldn't tell him, and Jimmy found out for himself. Or maybe Roble did tell him. Anyway, Jimmy looked at the cane. It was the one he always carried. He saw where, when Jimmy wasn't looking, Roble had been cutting little pieces off the end of it.
Robert Benchley. After attending Harvard, where he was editor of the Harvard Lampoon, Robert Benchley, 1889 to 1945, moved to New York and took a job at Vanity Fair, sharing an office with Dorothy Parker. He then covered the theater for Life magazine, was a regular contributor to The New Yorker, and wrote a column 3 times a week for the Hearst newspapers. Many of his pieces were collected in such popular volumes as Pluck and Luck, 1925, From Bed to Worse, 1934, and My 10 Years in a Quandary and How They Grew, 1936. He began to split his time between New York and Hollywood in the 1930s, writing and starring in numerous short features about the minor obstacles he faced during his day, always with himself as the brunt of the joke. In How to Sleep, he is tossing and turning as distractions prevent him from doing just that. It won the Academy Award for Best Short Subject in 1935. He was married to his childhood sweetheart, Gertrude Darling, from 1914 until his death of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1945. His son, Nathaniel Benchley, also became a successful writer, as did his grandson, Peter Benchley, the author of such mega-hits as Jaws and The Island. The Mystery of the Poisoned Kipper was first collected in No Poems or Around the World Backwards and Sideways in 1932. It took me 15 years to discover that I had no talent for writing, but I couldn't give it up because by that time I was too famous. Robert Benchley. The Mystery of the Poisoned Kipper by Robert Benchley. Who sent the poisoned kipper to Major General Hannafield of the Royal Welsh Lavaliers? That is the problem which is distorting Scotland Yard at the present moment, for the solution lies evidently in the breast of Major General Hannafield himself. And Major General Hannafield is dead. At any rate, he doesn't answer his telephone. Following are the details, such as they are. You may take them or leave them. If you leave them, please leave them in the coat room downstairs and say that Martin will call for them. One Saturday night, about 3 weeks ago, after a dinner given by the Royal Welsh Lavaliers for the Royal Platinum Watch, Major General Hannafield returned home just in time for late breakfast, which he really didn't want. In fact, when his wife said, rather icily, "I suppose you've had your breakfast," the Major General replied, "I'll thank you not to mention breakfast or lunch or dinner until such time as I give you the signal." Mrs. Hannafield thereupon packed her bags and left for her mother's in New Zealand. Along about 11:30 in the morning, however, the Major General extricated himself from the hat rack where he had gone to sleep and decided that something rather drastic had to be done about his mouth. He thought about getting a new mouth, but as it was Sunday, all the mouth shops were closed, and he had no chance of sending into London for anything. He thought of water, great tidal waves of water, but even that didn't seem to be exactly adequate. So naturally his mind turned next to kippered herring. "Send a thief to catch a thief" is an old saying, but a good one, and applies especially to Sunday morning mouths. So he rang for his man, and nobody answered. The Major General then went to the windows and called out to the gardener, who was wrestling with a dahlia, and suggested that he let those dahlias alone and see about getting a kipper, and what's more, a very salty kipper, immediately. This the gardener did. On receiving the kipper, the Major General, according to witnesses, devoured it with avidity, paper and all, and then hung himself back on the hat rack. This was the last that was seen of Major General Hannafield alive, although perhaps alive is too strong a word. Perhaps breathing would be better. Mrs. Hannafield, being on her way to New Zealand, has been absolved of any connection with the crime, if causing the Major General's death can be called a crime, as he was quite an offensive old gentleman. The gardener, from his cell in the Old Bailey, claims that he bought the kipper from a fish stall in the High Street, and the fish vendor in the High Street claims that he bought the kipper from the gardener. According to the officials of Scotland Yard, there are two possible solutions to the crime, neither of them probable: revenge or inadvertent poisoning of the kipper in preparation. Both have been discarded, along with the remainder of the kipper. Revenge as a motive is not plausible, as the only people who could possibly seek revenge on the Major General were killed by him a long time ago. The Major General was notoriously hot-tempered, and, when opposed, was accustomed to settling his neck very low in his collar and rushing all the blood available to his temples. In such states as this, he usually said, "Gad, sir," and lashed out with an old Indian weapon which he always carried, killing his offender. He was always acquitted on account of his war record. It is quite possible that some relatives of one of the Major General's victims might have tracked him from the Punjab or the Kit Kat Club to his diggings on Diggings Street, but he usually was pretty careful to kill only people who were orphans or unmarried. There was some thought at first that the Major General might have at one time stolen the eye of an idol in India and brought it back to England, and that some zealot had followed him across the world and wreaked revenge on him. A study of the records, however, shows that the Major General once tried to steal an emerald eye out of an Indian idol, but that idol succeeded in getting the Major General's eye instead, and that the Major General came back to England wearing a glass eye, which accounted for his rather baffling mannerism of looking over a person's shoulder while that person was talking to him. Now, as for the inadvertent poisoning of a kipper in the process of being cured, herring are caught off the coast of Normandy. They are also caught practically everywhere, but Normandy makes a better story. Brought to the shore by Norman fishermen dressed as Norman fishermen, and carried almost immediately to the kipperers. The herring kipperers are also under state control and are examined by government agents both before and after kippering. They are subjected to the most rigid mental tests, and have to give satisfactory answers to such questions as, "Do you believe in poisoning herring?" and "Which of the following statements is true? A. William the Norman was really a Swede. B. Herring, placed in the handkerchief drawer, give the handkerchief that je ne sais quoi. C. Honesty is the best policy. If the kipperers are able to answer these questions and can, in addition, chin themselves 12 times, they are allowed to proceed with their work, Otherwise, they are sent to the French Chamber of Deputies, or Devil's Island, for 10 years.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?